Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Elena Ivanovna. Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. We're beginning the panel session for the defense of the thesis by Elena Pervichko. The specialization is 190004, Medical Psychology. The topic is emotional regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases. Please switch off your mobile phones. Thank you. So, according to the appropriate legislation, the panel session is being broadcast via internet and it is also being interpreted into English. Under the federal law, as of the 23rd of May 2016, on amending Article 4 of the Federal Law on Science and State Scientific and Technical Policy, St. Petersburg State University and Moscow State University are entitled to confer academic degrees. However, the degrees are conferred only within the scientific specializations in branches of science specified by the Ministry of Science and Education. So this is the appropriate legislation that I would like to tell you about. The corresponding order is number 6821/1 on granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. This board panel was set up on the 1st of September 2016, and this is the first panel session of the dissertation board in psychology. I must also say that according to item 17 of section 3 of the regulation on the dissertation board for the defense of doctoral and candidate dissertations in St. Petersburg State University, the panel discussion is valid providing 2/3 of the appointed board members are present. But the total number is not to be fewer than 4 people. The dissertation board consists of 5 people. All of them are present, including 1 foreign board member. Therefore, we have a quorum. According to item 19 of section 4 of the above-mentioned regulation, the agenda is as follows. So, the chairman's presentation about the documents submitted by the candidate for the degree and their conformity with the requirements. Chairman's reply to questions, if any. The candidate's presentation providing an overview and findings of the research. No more than 20 minutes. Questions to the candidate regarding the presentation. No more than 2 minutes for each question. The candidate's reply to the questions. Reports on the thesis. The board members will be taking the floor in turns in order to give a detailed account of their opinions, suggestions and questions to the candidate. No more than 10 minutes per person. Number 5. The candidate's comments about the reports on the thesis. No more than 15 minutes. External reports on the thesis by Elena Pervichko. No more than 15 minutes. The candidate's comments about the external reports on the thesis. No more than 15 minutes. Questions from the audience. The floor will be given to the non-board attendees. They can give a brief account of their ideas or ask questions to the candidate about the topic of the research. No more than 5 minutes per person. It is necessary to fill in the registration form in advance and they should give their full name before the talk. The candidates' comments about the talks given by non-members of the board no more than 5 minutes. Then a 5-minute break before the open balloting of the board members on the issue of conferring or non-conferring the academic degree. The discussion of the results before the open balloting is not broadcast. Open balloting, vote counting and recording of the results in the protocol of the dissertation board, making a decision whether to confer or not the academic degree of St. Petersburg State University. And the candidate's closing speech. No more than 2 minutes. Мне ничего не слышно. Тебя слышно?
Да.
Now the chairman's presentation. The thesis by Elena Pervichko, submitted in conformity with the requirements for the degree of the Doctor of Science in Medical Psychology, Emotion Regulation in Patients with Cardiovascular Diseases. It was approved for the defense by the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg State University, number 7604/1. The dissertation board was set up by the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg State University, number 7464/1. The board members: Shilkova Olga, Doctor of Psychology, Professor, Department of Medical Psychology and Psychophysiology, the Chairman of the Dissertation Board. Valentina Babkov, Doctor of Psychology, Professor, Department of Medical Psychology and Psychophysiology, St. Petersburg State University. Svetlana Solovyova, Doctor of Psychology, Head of the Department of General and Medical Psychology at Mechnikov St. Petersburg State Medical Academy. Elena Isayeva, Doctor of Psychology, Head of the Department of General and Clinical Psychology of Pavlov St. Petersburg State Medical University. Matanova Vanya Lukova, Doctor of Psychology, Professor of the Department of Social, Labor and Educational Psychology of Sofia University of St. Clement Ohridsky, Bulgaria. The candidate has submitted the following documents: an application in the name of the rector about the admission and defense of the dissertation board was submitted on the 16th of January 2016, University Diploma and the Candidate of Science Diploma, list of academic papers containing 92 items which describe the research findings, including 58 academic papers that have been published in peer-reviewed journals recommended by the Ministry of Education and Science. The thesis in Russian and in English, a printed version and an e-version. The thesis formatting and reference list comply with the state standard. The thesis complies with the state standard. All the documents comply with the Section 3 of the Order on Granting Academic Degrees in St. Petersburg State University. We have also received reports on the thesis of the members of the dissertation board. Besides, we have received some extra materials, and I'm going to give you a list. We have received 12 extra reports from the members of the academic community, 6 records of implementation of the main research findings in the educational and academic process, 2 empirical evidence endorsement records. Then a letter of appeal from the professor from Moscow State University, Alexander Tkosov, as of the 17th of May 2017. I'm not going to read out the number. and a letter of appeal from Professor Tosov as of the 15th of September 2017. You can see the number on the website. A letter from Elena Pervichko to the Secretary of the Academic Board as of the 26th of May 2017. We also have the record of the original research as of the 1st of September 2017. This report was made by the Expert Center of the Russian Academy of Science, and it was signed by Professor Pahomenko and the director of this analytical center, Professor Yeroshenko, also signed this report of the original research. There's also the minutes of the Dissertation Board number 2 and the minutes of the Dissertation Board number 1. Now I must ask the following question. Are there any questions regarding the list of documents submitted by the candidate? I address this question should be asked regarding the list of documents which were submitted by the candidate according to the appropriate order. As for the extra reports and other documents, I must say that the other documents will be discussed during the defense process. Are there any questions regarding the list of documents? Hello. Alexander Tosov has a question. I would like to ask the following question. I have written about this issue. There was a dissertation board. From the materials posted on the website, I cannot say how much data was collected and how much data was studied according to the thesis. I would like to answer this question. Your questions and comments that we have seen in your letter of appeal will be dealt with during the defense process. But this letter of appeal is not on the list of obligatory documents which are supposed to be on the list of documents submitted by the candidate for the degree. We will answer your questions, but in due time. Are there any questions regarding the major documents submitted by the candidate for the degree? Now the floor is given to Elena Pervichko. You have 20 minutes.
Mrs. Chairwoman, members of the Dissertation Board and colleagues, I would like to present the results of my dissertation written in the topic emotion regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases. It's well known that disease is ranked #1 in prevalence, disability rates and premature death rates. This study is relevant as it is in line with the current demands of modern healthcare as regards specification of etiology and pathogenesis of cardiovascular diseases. The latter is necessary for precise diagnostic prevalence and the delivery of comprehensive support to patients. Studies in emotion regulation are relevant in the more general theoretical and methodological context. Here I mean higher stress levels in modern society, steady growth of psychosomatic, depressive and anxiety disorders, high levels of addictive and antisocial behavior. purpose of the research was to study of emotion regulation in patients with mitral valve prolapse, patients with essential arterial hypertension, healthy people. Creation of a conceptual model of emotion regulation in NOM and in such forms of cardiovascular pathology I have mentioned. Emotion regulation is defined as an aggregate of unconscious and unconscious mental process that may strengthen, weaken, modify, redirect, or keep at one level the quality and intensity of emotional reactions and emotional states of a human to allow him to function adaptively. I have formulated 2 general and 4 particular hypotheses of my study. The first general hypothesis: emotion regulation can be presented as a system comprised of psychological and physiological levels. At that, in the structure of psychological level, in turn, motivational and scene level and operation and technical level of regulation can be distinguished. The operation and technical level in the structure of emotion regulation is represented by the strategies of emotion regulation chosen by the subject at solving emotiogenic situations. Strategies of emotion regulation as a subject actualization of choice of actions and ways of mediation which are adequate to the solution of the task of emotion regulation on the basis of the resources for optimization of the subject's emotional state. The second general hypothesis is as follows: personal reflection and sign-symbolic mediation of emotion serve as a significant psychological mechanisms of emotion regulation. I do not intend to speak at length about the theoretical and methodological foundations of my research. I'd like to know that the theoretical and methodological basis of my study was laid by the basic foundations of cultural activity paradigm, the school by Vygotsky, Leontiev, Luria, and Zeigarnik. I have developed a theoretical methodological complex to conduct a study.
Then I also studied some frustrating reactions according to the modified tests.
The participants were given the following situations. So, to select from the proposed situations those which could injure them personally in a greater or lesser degree. They were presented a set of 73 cards with emotional descriptors. It was suggested to pick up those words which would help to express the emotions they experienced in those situations. Then they had to answer 2 questions. What would you answer in this situation? That was A. B. What would you think in that situation? And C. What would you have to answer to lessen the traumatic level of the situation? We also conducted a projective motivational test by Heckhausen. We used clinical and psychological interview, the method of expert evaluations, statistical data processing was carried out as well. The study was conducted from 1993 to 2015 on an outpatient basis. The data was provided by the staff of the Department of Hospital Therapy No. 1 from Moscow State University of Medicine and Dentistry, named after Yevdokimov. The project leader, a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Professor Martinov, and the staff of the Department of Faculty Therapy and Professional Diseases, the same university. The project leader, Professor Ostromova, head of the department, academician Sokolov. Research involved 3 groups of patients. Number 1, patients with mitral valve prolapse, patients with hypertension at work, which experience increased blood pressure in working time, patients with steadily increased blood pressure, so patients with the so-called classical essential hypertension. We had 85 people. In the research of patients with mitral valve prolapse, there were 73 healthy individuals, and with hypertension, with both groups, we had 82 healthy persons. As for the findings we submit for defense. Personal reflection and science symbolic mediation of emotion serve as significant psychological mechanism of emotion regulation. The system of emotion regulation differs from the system of emotion regulation in healthy people. Emotion regulation in normal pathology is a system. It includes psychological and physiological levels. At the same time, in the structure of psychological level, motivational and sense level, and operational and technical level can be distinguished. The system of emotion regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases differs from the system of emotion regulation in healthy people. Presence of the expressed conflict of motives, aspiration to success and avoiding failure, deficit of personal reflection, distortions in science symbolic mediation of emotions, limitation in the use of the resources of available strategies of emotion regulation. Number 4, state of emotional tension arising in the subject in emotogenic situation comes to act as a background characteristic which negatively affects the ability of efficient emotion regulation. Number 5, the durable state of emotional tension which remains after the release because of inefficiency of emotion regulation acts as a major psychological prerequisite in forming the clinical symptomatology. Number 6, deficit of personal reflection and distortions of science symbolic mediation of emotions can be regarded as significant psychological mechanism of disorders of emotion regulation. The study included 5 stages. Number 1, emotion regulation in solving the tasks of perceptual choice of emotionally significant situations and emotion descriptors. Number 2, emotion regulation in the dynamics of primary and secondary responses. Number 3, strategies of emotion regulation in emotionally significant situations. Number 4, emotion regulation in the states of mental tension. Number 5, comparative analysis of the results of emotion regulation research in patients with a range of cardiovascular diseases with different severity of symptoms.
While we were making our studies, it turned out that people with cardiovascular diseases are more sensible to emotional situations. We came to this conclusion according to our descriptors that we got from our results. We have seen the categories in patients with cardiovascular diseases and in healthy patients. And here we see that negative emotions are more prevalent.
As is evident from data analysis, the reactions in the primary responses of patients with cardiovascular diseases, in particular tension at work, reveal obstacle-dominant, ego-defensive, and extra-punitive patterns. Based on this, we can conclude that the primary responses of patients with CVD often contain accusation, censure, or even open hostility addressed to their interlocutors. When they come back to the secondary answers, the negativism even increases. The actualized emotions can be interpreted as those which do not find their reflection in verbal signs. Then we conducted the content analysis of the answers of the participants. What would you answer in this situation, and what would you supposed to answer in this situation to reduce the traumatic experience? Each answer was codified in 2 criterion. First criterion, focus on regulatory efforts of the subject on the optimization of their emotional state by transformation of cognitive structure of experiences, by actualization of new personal senses and introduction of additional means stimuli. These are internal strategies. On the change of expressive characteristics of emotions and the solution of communicative tasks in situations of social interaction, on the change of emotional state of the communication partner, and thereby indirectly on the solution of the problem of emotion regulation. These are external strategies. The second criterion is the appealability of the subject to the necessary extent to various forms of science-symbolic mediation. According to the results of content analysis of the aggregate responses of examinees, we have distinguished 4 classes of strategies typical for both patients with CVD and healthy persons. These are internal cognitively mediated strategies, external cognitively mediated strategies, internal cognitively non-mediated strategies, and external cognitively non-mediated strategies. The study has revealed that patients with cardiovascular diseases, with hypertension at work in particular, differ from healthy people by significantly less using involuntary reacting such strategies as consecutive actualization of new senses, the transformation of experiences using humor, and subject-subject interactive transformations. The character of these reactions in patients with cardiovascular disease in patients, these strategies change in terms of their higher adaptivity and using more complex in terms of science and symbolic mediation strategies. At this point, the strategies used by healthy persons, healthy people still use more complex structures. When modeling the emotional load, it was revealed that patients with CVD, unlike healthy persons, show a significantly greater increase in systolic and diastolic blood pressure at the end of experiment. It was especially true for the patients with mitral valve prolapse and hypertension at work. The comparison. The table shows that the level of emotion regulation in patients with mitral valve prolapse and hypertension at work, both before and after the experiment, is much higher than in patients with essential arterial hypertension in healthy people. The data on nonverbal activity is especially interesting. It was shown that patients with cardiovascular diseases, with hypertension at work in particular, are fundamentally different from the control group by all the evaluation parameters. When modeling the emotional load, patients with hypertension at work show the biggest amount of facial expressions and changes in the tone of voice. As this table shows, patients with mitral valve prolapse and hypertension at work significantly outstrip healthy people and patients with essential arterial blood pressure in the frequency of non-formable and rigidly low level of aspiration. As a result, we have obtained that in 78.7% of the healthy study participants, the state of operational tension arose under experimental conditions, and 82.4% in the same experimental conditions, the state of emotional tension arose. The use of emotion regulation strategies, both with CVD patients, healthy person, depends on the type of mental tension. As a motivational basis for emotion regulation, we have the conflict of achievements. The comparative analysis of the results of emotion regulation in patients with CVD regarding the severity of symptoms, which was conducted using the statistical analysis methods and the method of qualitative data analysis. At the Vygotsky-Luria School, we have obtained the results which allowed to conclude that there is a relationship between the clinical symptoms of mitral valve prolapse and hypertension at work with the parameters of emotion regulation. To summarize, let me draw upon some conclusions. Number one, emotion regulation in norm and pathology is a system. It includes psychological and physiological levels. In the structure of physiological level, motivational and sense level, and operation and technical levels can be distinguished. Number 2, the system of emotion regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases differs from the system of emotion regulation in healthy people in the presence of the expressed conflict of motives, aspiration to success and avoiding failure, deficit of personal reflection, distortions in symbolic mediation of emotions, and limitations in the use of available strategies, the use for emotion regulation. Conclusion 3. Patients with the examined forms of cardiovascular pathology differ from healthy people in significantly more frequent occurrence of the emotional tension under the conditions of emotional load, which manifested itself in a number of indicators. Psychological indicators of level of aspiration as well. Number 4. The state of emotional tension later on acquires the status of a background characteristic, which negatively affects the ability of successful emotion regulation in emotionally difficult situations. Conclusion 5. Presence of a durable state of emotional tension which occurs in emotionally significant situations and remains after the release is significant psychological prerequisite of formation of clinical manifestation in case of mitral valve prolapse and hypertension at work. Emotion regulation strategies can be typologized as follows. Cognitively non-mediated strategies. Non-mediated solving of perceptual choice, internal non-mediated strategies, external cognitively non-mediated strategies such as a strategy of direct expression of emotions, internal cognitively non-mediated strategies which used when formulate the answer. Comparison and devaluation, gradual actualization of new senses, and the transformation of emotions using humor and metaphors. External cognitively transforming strategies used in formulation of an answer. Suppression of emotion expression, strategy of conflict communicative reacting, and strategy of subject-subject interactive transformations. Patients with mitral valve prolapse and patients with essential hypertension differ from healthy people by a significantly rare use of such emotions as consecutive actualization of new senses, transformation of experience by means of humor, and subject-subject interactive transformations. This indicates an underuse of, unlike healthy people, of sign-symbolic mediation and reflection. Patients with the examined forms of cardiovascular pathology significantly more frequently than healthy individuals use such emotion regulation strategies as diffusion of choice, limited range of choice of emotionally significant events, and the absence of cognitive transformations when formulating the answer, which is most clearly demonstrated in spontaneous reacting. That points to the underuse of sign-symbolic mediation, both at the perception of an emetogenic situation and at formulation of its verbal context. Conclusion 9. Patients with hypertension at work and mitral valve prolapse significantly differ from healthy persons in a more frequent use of such emotions as ruminations and catastrophization and suppression of emotion experiences. This allows to make a conclusions that their emotion regulation system is distorted. Obtained results in total prove the competency of the conclusion that reflection and sign-symbolic mediation of emotions act as significant psychological mechanisms of emotion regulation. Two final conclusions. From a switch from spontaneous reacting to solving the task of voluntary emotion regulation in patients, there is increase in the frequency of use of strategies which are more complicated from the cognitive point of view and are more effective in terms of regulatory effect. It proves the presence of, in the individual experience, the possibility of the actualization of such experiences under the conditions of external stimulation. And the final conclusion, psychotherapy is advisable for certain patients. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're now ready to answer the questions on the presentation.
So, please, members of the board, what are your questions? So, Professor Solovyova, your question. Dear Elena Ivanovna, I would like to ask you a few questions. The first question regards the methods in modern medicine according to current attitudes, according to the personalized paradigm. It is common knowledge that there is no common mechanism for forming the symptoms. There are no common psychological portraits for people with different diseases. However, in your presentation, we have seen a generalization which says patients have generalized characteristics. In this connection, I would like to say, do you really think that there is a single psychological portrait of patients with hypertension and for patients with a mitral valve prolapse? Thank you very much for your question. I don't think so. We can't make such generalizations. However, our study has revealed that the cohorts of the patients and research subjects showed the following things. They have some common characteristics. And we cannot say that there is a universal mechanism. But in my study, I looked at the contribution of two mechanisms: the symbolic, mediation, and reflection. According to the results, I believe that we have proved that these mechanisms make a contribution to the emotion regulation process in these patients. I have another question. Getting back to the methods, there is an assumption that any phenomenon has its own mechanism of formation, and we can see several aspects of including different aspects such as cognitive, emotional, and motivational factors. In this connection, I would like to ask the following question. You regard emotional regulation as a system that includes a psychological and a physiological level, but you do not look at the social level. Although emotion regulations are important because they are reactions to the social events. However, you speak about the necessity for psychological counseling to people in stressful situations, which means that people react to social situations and react to stress. So why did you exclude social factors from your system? I must say that my model, like any other model in the science, has its own limitations. But the symbolic mediation is very important, and according to the cultural activity paradigm, we can say that cultural and social factors also play an important role. But in general, the model is open for further improvements. Thank you. And I have another question. So, to speak about emotion regulation, we used the method of expert evaluation. and you used 3 psychologists for the expert evaluation. What did you mean by expert psychologists that have a degree in the appropriate area? Do you think that 3 people is enough for the expert evaluation? According to the provisions of expert analysis, 3 competent experts is enough for the expert evaluation. I believe that those experts were competent enough. They expressed their opinion independently, and then we found common ground in their opinions. And my last question, it regards Franz Alexander. So the underlying principle of your method is the school by Vygotsky and Luria. However, you mentioned Franz Iskanderov, who is the founder of the psychosomatic approach in medicine, and he wrote a lot about the role of emotional conflict in the formation of somatic pathology. For example, hypertension means blocked anger and aggression. And in your thesis you write the following thing: suppression can be one of the factors leading to this disease. So what concept do you rely on Alexander's concept, or do you rely on somebody else's concept, or have your own understanding of the issue? Thank you very much for your question. Of course, we cannot make generalizations here. There are 2 different approaches and different traditions here. We can say the following. One of the main findings in my research is as follows. If we use another theoretical assumption, we can develop our study further. For example, if we speak about suppression, we can say that suppression of the expressive component is an important thing here. For example, we can use 2 terms, repression and suppression. Suppression of the conflict and is one thing, and suppression of emotions is another thing. But I would like that in my thesis I spoke about the suppression of the emotional component. Are there any questions? Now, Professor Ababkov. So your thesis is very important, and you started your work more than 20 years ago. And the work was connected with the period and with the methods relevant in that period. But over this period of time, we have seen the publication of many other academic papers. Probably we should have a different approach to this issue when the methods have changed over the past 20 years. Or do you think your research findings cannot change? Well, the research has been going on for so many years. It has its own advantages and disadvantages. Some of these patients are still available for research, especially patients with the mitral valve prolapse, and we have an opportunity to follow up these patients. This is an advantage, although this is not mentioned in the thesis. But as for the general theoretical assumptions, I tend to say that I identify myself with the theoretical traditions of the cultural activity paradigm. But as for the methodical guidelines and for the design, I must say that if I were doing this research now, I would probably be doing it differently. Moreover, we have seen the publications by colleagues which show different attitude towards the issue in question. And unfortunately, I think that some papers must be published in due time. And I think that this intercultural discourse is extremely necessary here. Today there are more opportunities for the psychophysiological research, and we did not have such opportunities back then. Now, the question from Elena Isaeva. Dear Elena Ivanovna, in your thesis, you try to develop the model of emotional regulation. You write about strategies of emotional regulation, which are very similar to the mechanisms of protection. What can you say about it? Thank you very much for your question. I can answer this question later because you wrote this question in your report. But to sum up, I can say the following. It is a very wide discourse, and this area is very difficult. So in my thesis, I write about these categories. As for the emotion regulation strategies, I can say that this issue is a borderline issue. And now we have seen lots of papers devoted to emotion regulation. And of course, I mean works by Grossa. In these works, the scientists emphasize that emotion regulation involves emotion regulation at a specific moment. So emotion regulation is devoid of any generalizations. And we see in foreign papers the following idea. This specific approach to emotion regulation will allow us to make our discourse more specific and to see the difference between the mechanism of psychological defense and psychological strategies. But if we look at the historical aspect, we can see that emotion regulation has a long history. But right now, in papers by Grossa, we see cognitive and psychological traditions. Thank you. Are there any questions? If there are no questions, are there any questions from the non-board members?
As I have to be brief, could we please have conclusion 3 on the screen? No more than 3 minutes per question, please. I'll try to keep brief. So as I have to be concise, so I have a question about conclusion 3, which regards biochemical parameters. I'd like to find out which design of your research allowed you to make this conclusion, because the real research focused on one group only. You haven't used any comparisons, you haven't used a control group. I'd like to get an idea of the design of your research. Could you please keep brief? Thank you very much for your question. As regards the research of biochemical indicators, catecholamines in urine, androstenedione in blood plasma, and renin in blood plasma, the research of biochemical parameters was not conducted by me personally, as you can understand, as is given in the Thesis. This was done by doctors, and the evaluation was conducted by biochemical laboratories. The question is, which design allowed you to make these conclusions? Here you have table 56 and 57, and it states here that the research focused on one group only. I do not understand if there is any design at all. I do not understand if there is anything like that in science in general. Thank you very much for your remark. I remember you had this question, and I also remember that I have thoroughly answered this question before. There were some doctors present at the meeting, and I suppose they made clear enough explanations and statements about this aspect of my research. There were two groups of patients. Accordingly, we had patients with hypertension induced by stress, and patients with arterial hypertension. You can find this information in the text of my thesis, and the comparative analysis then was conducted. Colleagues, you are welcome with your short questions and no less short answer, please. Please don't make references to our previous meetings. I'd like to say that I'm not satisfied with the answer because the table has it one group only. Now the second question then. As regards the papers published, as regards the topic of the dissertation, one work was published in 2015. The development of the Russian Society of Psychologists, that is the paper title. How does this paper refer actually to the topic of the research? If there is any connection or reference, could you please cite the text? I'd like to make my contribution here. According to the agenda, we only now have questions according to the agenda, and here questions only concern presentation made by the candidate about the findings of the research and major conclusions. So your questions can remain for discussion. If there are any more questions regarding the conclusions and the results of the study, you're welcome to ask them now. Shall we answer the question now? Let's answer it later during the discussion, because now we're supposed to be talking about the findings. Dear colleagues, thank you for your questions. If there are no more questions, let us proceed to the discussion of two reports. We have received 5 reports. We duly received them according to the relevant legislation of St. Petersburg State University. They were all posted on the official website of St. Petersburg State University. Despite that, I'd like every board member provide their report with their remarks and their questions. Let's follow the list given in the order on the dissertation board. So we're going to start with Olga Sholkova, Professor Olga Sholkova, the chairwoman of the board. So I'd like to give my reports on the dissertation. Valentin Ababkov. Please get ready for the second report. The Thesis by Elena Pervichko focuses on the theoretical analysis and empirical study of motion regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases, which, according to the World Health Organization, ranked #1 among civilization diseases, ranking #1 in disability and death patterns of non-infectious diseases, and ranked the second in morbidity patterns in the global population. Currently, there is no need to prove that psychological factors can trigger cardiovascular diseases and affect their progress. Modern research requires a comprehensive approach, a differentiated and really substantial study of both psychological predispositions as well as changes which affected the psyche by the disease, as well as the psychological adaptation to the disorder. It's obvious that in this complex system of psychosomatic and somatopsychic interrelations in cardiovascular disease, the problem of emotion regulation is central. In this regard, Pervichko's research is relevant to the state of the art in the role of state of the art in the research of the role of psychological factors in the development of cardiovascular diseases. The aim of the thesis was to study emotion regulation in patients with mitral valve prolapse, patients with essential arterial hypertension, and healthy people. Pervichko also aimed to create a conceptual model of emotion regulation in health and the above-mentioned forms of cardiovascular diseases. This aim was reached through a range of independent empirical research works, which are given in chapters from 4 to 8. Each stage had its own aims and objectives. Each stage has its own conclusions. This structure of research shows that it was a large-scale and a really differentiated research. However, it complicates to get an overall picture of emotion regulation, which is given in General Hypothesis 1. To a certain degree, this is dispelled in Chapter 9, which summarizes the research results. The materials methodical and organizational chapters include a bulk of material which explains patient groups, methods, stages, and series of research based upon relevant citations. It's unusual, for example, that the choice of clinical groups is given in Chapter 3 after they were thoroughly described in Chapter 2. These specific features of the structure of the thesis must have some logic behind that, but the dissertation is pretty big, 9 chapters and about 40 sections, 12 appendices. It makes it difficult to get an overall comprehension of that. Despite that, the thesis has some theoretical and practical value. The emotion regulation is a dynamic system which has an interrelation of psychological, physiological and psychological level. There we have motivational and sense, operational and technical levels. A series of original experiments proves that reflection, insight, symbolic mediation act as meaningful psychological mechanism of emotion regulation. She offers a general typology of emotion regulation, which includes cognitively non-mediated and cognitively transforming strategies, each of which solves a task of perceptive choice and can be directed internally or externally. For medical psychology, this data is especially meaningful. The data is about the differences in emotion relation in patients with cardiovascular diseases and the difference in emotion relation of healthy people. So 3 clinical groups show different ways of emotion regulation. Patients with mitral valve prolapse and hypertension at work, unlike those having essential arterial hypertension with stably high blood pressure. So for them, we have proved that manifestations of the disease are really connected with emotional overload and emotional tension. This adds to the existing picture about the mechanism of formation of symptoms of cardiovascular diseases. the analytical review offered by the author in Chapter 1, 2, and 3. Overall, we have 859 sources, 483 of them are written in foreign languages, are really valuable. They show historical development and state-of-the-art in the research of emotion regulation in health and in disease in the global science. As for the novelty of the research, then the novelty regards the results of the empirical study. The difference between healthy and unhealthy people lies primarily in the motivational conflicts, the poor use of resources, which the strategies of emotional regulation have, and deficit of personal reflection. For the development of science, the data about sign and symbolic mediation and more effective strategies of emotion mediation is really important. So the ones that are used when transfer from spontaneous to voluntary regulation, so that is in the situations of identification of reflexive process. So this opens up technologies of psychological intervention. Here we can discard unproductive forms and use productive forms instead. So the results of the study are marked by practical value. The results are a complex of psychological predictors which worsen the symptoms of cardiovascular diseases. The findings are really valid, which is supported by solid theoretical basis. So here we have the basic foundations of modern systemology, according to which emotion regulation is analyzed as an open self-development system. The thesis is also based on the foundations of Russian psychology. Here, I mean, works by Vygotsky, Levy, and Rubinstein, the culture activity paradigm, and the study about higher mental functions. Also, I should mention the modern biopsychosocial model of health and disease, and person-oriented paradigm, personalized paradigm of medicine and medical psychology. I would like to highlight once again that the theoretical basis of the dissertation is one of the big advantages of the thesis. The methodology included the methods of clinical psychology and experimental psychological methods. So, for example, we should also mention physiological and biochemical research, such as, for example, defining the level of reactive anxiety, which was conducted twice. The psychological experiment was conducted using the picture association method by Rosenzweig, and the classical variant of the motivation test of the aspiration level by Heckhausen. So the methods were central in the methodological complex. They do not presuppose, they abandon tough psychometric procedures in favor of content and sense analysis. The use of psychological methods based upon qualitative analysis of the behavior and statements made by the examinees make the process of the research really individualized and non-formal, due to which these methods are really popular in applied clinical psychodiagnostics. However, if we take a research like that, based on an expert evaluation, this has to be complemented by some metric methods. They will allow to make conclusions not only about the presence or absence of the examined property, according to the opinion of the experts, but also it allows to make an opinion if these parameters refer to the population number or not, that is standardized methods. So here I mean the methods of quantitative and research and metric diagnostic. It is conceivable that this methodological basis of the dissertation has some logics behind it. So perhaps that's based upon the author's vision, which was shaped in a certain psychological school. In this respect, I would like to hear the author's explanation about that. There are some technical remarks I'd like to make. So, for example, in an editorially brief overview of research methods, only 12 pages in the dissertation. Here, I mean the criteria of evaluation of video recordings. The set of mathematical and statistical methods is adequate to the tasks, to the objectives of the research. The practical value of the research is that it can be used to design programs of psychological prevention of diseases and psychological support of patients who have such diseases. The modification of the picture association method offered by the author is really interesting. It's based on the principles of the experimental psychosemantics. Despite the remarks I have given, the dissertation by Elena Pervichko, Emotion Regulation in Patients and Cardiovascular Diseases, is a complete graduate research work which provides empirical data and theoretical conclusions. The combination of which might be regarded as a major contribution to development of medical science. The author has published a range of papers in top-rated Russian international editions. So the dissertation is relevant and it complies with the major requirements set forth by Order 6821/1 as of the 1st of September 2016. The candidate can be awarded the academic degree of the Doctor of Psychology. The specialization is 190004, Medical Psychology. I would like you to answer the questions and remarks I have made in my report. I'm thankful for the attention and interest you have shown to my thesis, for the remarks that you have made and the questions you have asked. So I'd like to answer your first question about the structure of the dissertation. According to the idea I had in mind, Chapter 2 is a logical continuation to Chapter 1. In Chapter 1, I focused on the general psychological models of emotion regulation and empirical research in this area. In Chapter 2, emotion regulation was regarded in diseased and in healthy persons at the same time. Here I applied cultural activity paradigm. This analysis, as I saw it, allowed me to draw closer to the problematics of my research and to the formulation of hypotheses. So this chapter was conceived as the central methodological chapter in my thesis. So following the rules and traditions, the chapter in methodology is supposed to provide the characteristics of the research participants, the examinees, and this is what I show in this chapter. What concerns which psychological properties patients with mitral valve prolapse and hypertension at work have, as it regards really substantial research. So I had to provide a separate chapter for this part of my research. Let me focus on your second remark about the principle of integrity of modern research. I really try to stick to this principle in the research we conduct. What regards the topic of emotion regulation, that's not that as easy as it seems. This is a very acute issue. Still, it remains, fortunately or unfortunately, is relatively new in this area. And so far, we haven't yet obtained really working tools to conduct research in this area. I can only mention two questionnaires, a question about emotion regulation. Let me specify that it has 10 questions. 6 of them aim to find out the strategies of suppression of expression. The psychometric characteristics are really effective. When it comes to Western applications, they are not that reliable. It's doubtful. In general, when we use questionnaires to get answers from patients concerning their emotion regulation, it's very likely that we will have a degree of not very relevant answers in some of them. So far, this questionnaire has not been used in Russia. Thank you. Thank you very much. You can take your seat.
Now the floor is given to Valentina Babkov. Dear colleagues, I'll be sitting if you don't mind. First of all, I would like to say a few words. I think that we had to go a long way to this defense, and unfortunately, the main burden was carried by our chairman, and I would like to say thank you to Professor Sholkova and to show my support, because we were able to go such a long way and organize this defense. And thank you for the professional attitude when you were dealing with the difficult issues, when you were preparing for this defense. And I would like to say that Professor Sholkova is a very competent person. She was able to do her best and to achieve the results. Now I would like to read out my report on the thesis, so that we follow the protocol. The relevance of the research is determined by wide use of cardiovascular diseases, the insufficient studies of emotional factors in the symptom formation of these diseases. Most research works relevant to the field emphasize the pathogenic role of negative emotions and the inability of patients to regulate them. Psychotherapeutical treatment of emotion regulation disorders requires the knowledge of the reasons for these diseases. The thesis is scientifically credible as the author uses up-to-date research, methods of analysis and statistical processing of the materials that she received. She is able to lay out all the research findings, and the author also analyzes prior theoretical works, theoretical approaches to emotion regulations. Besides, she comes to the conclusion that current research works lack consistency. So her analysis of the prior works allowed her to develop an authentic approach to studying emotion regulation, and then she implements this approach in relation to patients with the mitral valve prolapse, essential hypertension, including the so-called hypertension at work, in comparison with almost healthy people. The logical analysis of the data allows her to come to the following conclusions. Emotion regulation in cardiovascular diseases is a complex system which includes psychological and physiological levels. She states that patients have stable emotional tension. Besides, the author describes different emotional regulation strategies. And she also recommends psychological and psychotherapeutical treatment of patients and people of risk groups. The empirical part of the thesis follows the theoretical part. The chapter, which is devoted to the methods of studies, the author describes the characteristics of the groups of patients and healthy people that acted as research subjects. She speaks about the steps of her research and uses complementary methods which are in line with her objectives. The conclusions reflect the research itself and allow us to say that the work was conducted at a very high methodological and theoretical level. The conclusions are consistent with the objectives. The author describes both the practical and theoretical value of the work. The research findings, conclusions, and recommendations that we find in the thesis are credible, since they are based on the amount of data which is sufficient for this type of work. The survey included 459 research subjects, of which 134 were patients with the mitral valve prolapse, 170 were patients with the essential hypertension, and 155 practically healthy people, which were comparable in terms of their social and demographic indicators. The author uses theoretical assumptions, valid psychological and physiological methods, as well as methods of statistical processing, which all are in line with the objectives. The novelty of the research is defined by the following thing. The author develops the model which is based on the cultural activity paradigm. And this model allows her to identify two levels of emotion regulation. Psychological level, which includes motivational and cognitive as well as operational and technical levels, and the physiological level of emotional regulation. The research data allows the author to identify three cognitive non-mediated and three cognitive transforming types of emotional regulation strategies. The results of the work will allow us in the future to develop psychological and pathophysiological diagnostics, as well as psychological counseling, which takes into account clinical physiological characteristics of patients with cardiovascular diseases, and allow us to organize preventive measures in risk groups. The author developed, designed, and conducted scientific research. The author also developed theoretical, methodological, and methodical concept of emotion regulation, which was done due to the experimental part of the research. And the author developed the algorithm of research in line with its objectives. Elena Pervichko identified the methods and developed an inquiry form, collected and processed the data, analyzed, interpreted the material, as well as formulated the major hypotheses, assumptions, main research findings, conclusions, and general recommendations. The thesis has a traditional structure It consists of 9 chapters. Each chapter is accompanied by an analysis and discussion of the results. It also has 11 conclusions and a large reference list, which includes 376 items in Russian and 483 items in foreign languages. Unfortunately, 18 items lack the number of pages. The thesis is 395 pages long. The thesis is illustrated with numerous pages and tables and has appendices. However, the number of pictures is not enough for the graphic representation of the results. In general, I can say that the quality and the quantity of the material, the design of the research and the methods are in line with the objectives. The conclusions comply with the objectives of the results as well. The main research findings are well argumented and well proven. The research papers were published in numerous journals. 5 of them were published in the peer-reviewed journals recommended by the Ministry of Science and Education, and the papers reflect the main research findings. Now I would like to ask some questions about the thesis. So, the cultural activity paradigm is regarded as an underlying principle in this thesis. However, the thesis does not contain any research of culture. The research methodology of the thesis is claimed to be a comprehensive one. However, the research methodology is not that comprehensive, since it has specific and limited psychological and physiological methods, which are justified, but they cannot be regarded without the general context. However, the work does not say anything about the diathesis stress theory, which is popular in Western psychology. In order to give an objective assessment of emotion and behavior, it is necessary to conduct experimental studies in natural conditions. However, the research was done under laboratory conditions, which allow for cognitive representation of past events instead of real behavior and emotional reaction of research subjects. The scientific novelty should be formulated differently. The model of emotion regulation was developed with the use of the new research methods and on new contingent. Any thesis has its own limitations, since it is done by a single researcher. Many issues remain unsolved and lack accurate answers because they must be solved by scientific communities. Therefore, we see some inaccuracies and inconsistencies in the thesis. However, the research paper by Elena Pervichko complies with the requirements. Now a few questions about the inconsistencies in the work. I have 4 questions. What is the prospective role of culture in emotion regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases? Can we use the diathesis stress theory to understand emotion regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases? The research was done under laboratory conditions, so to what extent did you take into account this fact? Number 4, it is more typical to speak about the coronary artery disease when we speak about cardiovascular diseases. and also atherosclerosis. So why did you choose patients with mitral valve prolapse? Is it because this disease is not sufficiently studied? So, Thesis by Elena Pervichko, Emotional Regulation in Patients with Cardiovascular Diseases, complies with the major requirements set forth by the order 6821/1 as of September the 1st, 2016. This dissertation work, so it complies with the above-mentioned order because it is relevant and has scientific novelty. And I must say that the candidate can be awarded the academic degree of the Doctor of Psychology. The specialization is 192004, Medical Psychology, Psychological Science. Thank you. Now I give the floor to Elena Pervichko. Thank you, Professor Ababkov. Thank you for showing interest in my work. As for your first question about the influence of culture, I must say that in my thesis I wrote that emotions have symbolic mediation, and this is one of the main assumptions of the cultural activity paradigm. But if we speak about the influence of culture on emotional regulation, I can say that we see many examples of this. For example, many ethnographical types of research which deal with different ethnographical issues. As for the scientific research in this area, I can say that there are very few of them. And this is a very important prospective study. Thank you very much for your idea. For example, we see here Professor Matanova. For example, we might conduct research together with our Bulgarian colleagues. As for the diathesis stress model, I can say that this model can be used in my approach. This model is very common and widespread in Western psychology. Of course, you were right to ask about the research under laboratory conditions. However, it was not among our objectives to test our hypothesis in natural environment. But I can give a positive answer to your question, because patients have hypertension at work and they have many claims. As for the group of diseases, I can say that there are few works with the mitral valve prolapse, although this disease occurs very often. Unfortunately, I can boast that not long ago we saw the publication which is relevant to this research on this issue, and I'm one of the authors. Thank you. I'm satisfied with your answers. I would like to say that in the world we see lots of research devoted to cross-cultural variations and the influence of culture on different disorders. And we see such publications both in Russian and in foreign languages. Now, I give the floor to Elena Isayeva.
Mrs. Chairwoman, dear colleagues, Can you hear me all right? The thesis by Elena Pervichko focuses on the issue crucial for the research in psychosomatic relations, emotion, motivation, and sense and value sphere of personalities of patients with cardiovascular diseases. As of today, studies in emotion and motivation sphere are really promising in dynamic directions in modern clinical psychology. Most researchers underline the importance of psychological factors in pathogenesis of a range of somatic disorders, primarily cardiovascular diseases, where pathogenic role of emotions in contraction development of clinical symptoms is especially high. However, this area of psychology remains little studied, despite high profoundness and systematization of theoretical constructs about psychological determinants and mechanisms of emotion regulation in the system of psychological adaptation. Pervichko, in her thesis, regards the problem of emotion regulation in the light of cultural activity paradigm by Vygotsky and Luria, which adds significant theoretical and methodological value to the study. The core of the study is the use of science symbolic mediation and personal reflection in emotion regulation, developing the ideas of the classics of Russian psychology. The candidate brings forward the hypothesis that reflection and science symbolic mediations are really important in emotion regulation. The author regards mediation at two levels: motivational and science, operational and technical. Without them, regulatory processes, including emotion regulation, are impossible. Pervichko has established the connection between operation and technical and motivation science level, which in my view is exceptionally important and promising research idea, which can be used to study emotional irregularities in patients with other than cardiovascular disorders and clinical entities, for example, patients with schizophrenia. The original model of emotion regulation in health and disease offered by the author is really significant theoretically for modern Russian clinical psychology, and the well thought over original experimental psychological research stirs genuine interest and has a high scientific and practical value. Literature review is substantial. It's given in chapters 1 to 3, where the author analyzes historical and modern ideas about the emotional sphere of the person. She analyzes modern concept of psychological stress, and in my view, she is really great at comparing different theoretical models. She compares emotion regulation with other concepts such as coping, defense mechanism, emotional intelligence, and others, and substantiates her idea of the necessity of developing the model of emotion regulation. This wide scope of probes touched upon the dissertation has made it complex and diverse, and has made the author to be really careful and when analyzing the material. Despite the rather convincing and substantial conclusions, which logically summarize a great number of literary sources she has analyzed, are not always, sometimes disputable and not always valid. For example, in Hypothesis 1, Pervichko presupposes that emotion regulation takes place at two levels, physiological and psychological. She moves on to give a literature review where there is a strong correlation, which shows a strong correlation between physiological and emotional reactions. So where is the problem and where is the discussion here? Chapter 3 focuses on emotional and personal specifics of patients with cardiovascular diseases. The author makes the conclusion that in most research on patients with cardiovascular diseases, so in the recent years, there haven't been any particular conclusions about the role of emotions in the development of symptoms. In this respect, the model offered by Pervichko is really relevant and essential to solve the tasks that current medicine faces. In chapters from 4 to 8, we see major results of the thesis by Pervichko. The author has thoroughly studied and analyzed physiological and physiological levels in patients with congenital and acquired cardiovascular diseases in comparison with healthy people in experimental conditions of an increased emotional load. Talking about emotion regulation through a thorough psychological experiment, which included the evaluation of biochemical parameters. The author has managed to show how clinical symptoms affect the development of symptoms. The program of the examination of patients is one of the advantages of this work. I have to specify that the research was really careful. Here I can speak about the method that the author has used. She has conducted a step-by-step mathematical and statistical overview and processing of all the data. The author makes a good use of all the methods and the research tools. She has developed a diagnostic complex which included modification of picture frustration test by Rosenzweig, 3 stages, and experimental model of motion logo in Raven's progressive matrices, including the procedure of the evaluation of aspiration level. Apart from that, she has also used clinical psychological interview. So the relevance and accuracy of the results she has obtained lies in the method that she has used. The results she has achieved are in sync with the literature review she has provided. In general, I can conclude that the research is an original research. It's complete, it's really substantial, it's valuable. It shows that the author is really qualified and professional. The dissertation provides new scientific data, and the findings and conclusions she has made really make a great contribution into the study of emotion regulation in healthy condition and provide new insights into psychosomatic relations in clinical psychology. My general opinion is positive, but I'd like to specify a few controversial points. Number 1, page 213, table 36, we have two strategies of classes of emotion regulation. We have cognitively mediated and cognitively non-mediated strategies. First of all, according to well-known researchers in emotion regulation and emotional coping, that emotional reaction is always preceded by cognitive evaluation. Emotion, as is known, it's always some evaluation of an event. It's the characteristics of the individual's attitude towards going on. So how does your understanding of cognitive non-mediated strategies of emotion regulation correlate with these scientific facts? Secondly, I'd like to find out how cognitively mediated strategies of emotion regulation, how are they different from coping strategies specified by Carver and Schreier? Question 2. How did you define aspiration levels? Which procedure did you use to break them down into types? The author states that patients with cardiovascular diseases, unlike healthy people, give non-differentiable cognitive content or refuse to answer in emotionally significant situations. Can we compare these strategies with the alexithymia, which, according to many researchers, is really manifested in patients with such clinical entity? On page 334, the author states that preferential use of emotion regulation strategies is determined by motivation and actual emotional condition of the subject. This conclusion has something in common with the concept of stress and coping by Lazarus, where the key role in the choice of coping with stress was given to the perceiving and the cognitive evaluation of the situation. How can you comment upon that? Number 5, it's a pity that given mathematical and statistical data analysis, the author has not used factoring or cluster analysis to build statistically valid structured model of motion regulation, which includes clinical, physiological, psychological, and behavioral parameters. Statistical variables which the author uses in the toolkits are not enough. The model would have looked more graphic and convincing. The questions I'm asking are of polemic nature, and they don't undermine the value of the dissertation. The thesis by Elena Pervichko, Emotion Regulation Patients with Cardiovascular Diseases, complies with the major requirements set forth by Order 6821/1 as of the 1st of September 2016. The candidate can be awarded the academic degree of the Doctor of Psychology. This specialization is 190004, Medical Psychology, Psychological Science. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. You only have 5 minutes for your questions and comments. I'm really thankful for the interest you have shown to my research, for the remarks and comments that you have made. As regards your first question about external and internal strategies, well, I can take a long and a short way to answer that. Okay, I only have 5 minutes. So, as I see that in my research, I was able to show that patients with cardiovascular diseases have some specifics in the process of perception and the perception of stressful situations, and these specifics that they show is not limited to the ideas I have specified. I think you have this question because I would say, well, the question you're asking arose because of the different possible understanding that we have to the terminology that we use. Sometimes I just can't find analogous expressions to some terminology that I'm using. I keep getting questions about the terminology I use. Most reviews I get about my work are positive. As regards coping and emotion regulation, I have partly answered these questions. That was at the beginning of our session. As regards the research in the level of aspiration, this is thoroughly described in the Thesis, how we evaluated the stability, the adequacy of the aspiration level. Here we used sort of classic evaluation techniques. One of the publications about that is the publication by Karsten. It was published in 1972. Professor Berezdina also focused on this issue. So here we used several terms about stable level, unstable level, rigid. As regards your question about possible alexithymia of patients, I agree with you. Some parts of the group suffer from alexithymia, though we haven't tested this hypothesis. While talking about some causal relation between alexithymia and some regulatory disorders, I wouldn't really say that it's so. Each of the disorders have their own background. There is, in future, I think we will be able to speak about the dubious mediation. On the one hand, there is a cognitive evaluation of the threats, which leads to tension, but later this emotional tension leads to the makes the person more stressed. As regards question number 5, about the statistical methods that we used. We have collected a lot of statistical data. Your idea looks attractive, and this is something that I would like to make, but here the data is really diverse. So factoring of data or clusterization of data in this respect was actually impossible, because as the mathematical statistics demand clusterization or factoring of data requires the data of one level. Otherwise, we don't have a chance to make a proper interpretation of this data. This was the reason we opted for a multi-level model. As we have these two levels, then these statistical methods were not possible. In such circumstances, qualitative tools do not have any alternatives these days. Let's get back to question number 1. So talking about cognitively mediated and cognitively non-mediated emotions, I'm thoroughly convinced that all emotions are cognitively mediated. By cognitively non-mediated emotions, at the level of the perception of an event, I meant the choice, the diffusion choice. The participants of the research, in most cases we had patients with mitral valve prolapse and hypertension. They revealed the phenomenon of a distorted filtration. They really chose a lot of events, a range of events, both neutral and non-neutral events, and many descriptors. As regards the answer state, the stage of the answer, I mean the Rosenzweig tool, by cognitively non-mediated strategies, here I meant those answers when the subject did not make enough reference to the science of sign-symbolic mediation, to the strategies of sign-symbolic mediation. It happened when the expression really reveals the emotional state of the subject. So he verbalizes exactly what he feels. I would like to stop at this point and continue discussing this issue during a bit later. Now,
the floor is given to Professor Solovyova. So, dear colleagues, the thesis by Elena Pervichko is about one of the key factors that contribute to psychosomatic disorder of the cardiovascular system, emotional regulation. The psychosomatic approach to internal diseases appeared in the 70s, and it has been developing ever since. This approach states that there is no single mechanism of the development of a physical disease. However, there are several mechanisms that contribute to the development of the physical illness, including somatic, psychological and social factors. And the key role is given to emotions, which, on the one hand, show the physiological processes. Emotions act as signals, and their functions are similar to that of a pain. On the other hand, emotions show the importance of the external events. The topic of emotional regulation and mental activities is a foundation that allows us to interpret the role of psychosomatic and somasomatic connections. Later, we saw the development of a new paradigm which allows us to research, interpret, and organized treatment for patients with cardiovascular diseases. The increasing differentiation in approaches that allow us to develop a wide range of issues also allowed us to develop lots of preventive measures, treatment and rehabilitation. The thesis by Elena Pervichko, therefore, is relevant. The author uses basic theoretical assumptions of the cultural activity paradigm developed by Vygotsky-Leontiev and the methods of syndrome analysis developed by Vygotsky-Luria when interpreting emotion regulation. And this serves as a theoretical foundation of the thesis. The purpose of the thesis is studying emotion regulation in patients with mitral valve prolapse, patients with essential hypertension, and in healthy people. The author also wants to develop a conceptual model which allows to study emotional regulation in health and in disease. The object of the research is emotional regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases in comparison with healthy patients. The research also deals with structural and functional organization of emotion regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases in comparison with healthy people under the condition of emotional load. The author summarizes the prior research and papers. It is stated in the thesis that the conceptual models emphasize the role of emotions in symptoms development. However, the issue of emotion regulations is discussed at a phenomenological level, which does not allow us to understand the psychological mechanisms of the development of symptoms or to understand the psychological mechanisms of emotional regulation. The issue related to emotion regulation is still unresolved. The author says that it is generally accepted that cardiovascular diseases have a complex nature, and the author provides a generalization. Here I quote: "We can say that patients with the mitral valve prolapse and hypertension, including patients with hypertension at work, are described as difficult patients with many claims of different nature, and their claims and complaints do not correspond to the intensity of the disorder, which shows their stress and emotional tension." Taking into account the assumptions that emotions are socially determined, we can say that Vygotsky regarded emotional suffering as a unit, which is important for physiological and psychological levels. The physiological level makes the mental activities act at an optimal level. The author's model is used to justify and identify strategies of emotion regulation and allows the author to provide guidance for different rehabilitation and treatment measures. As a result, the authors say that the model, which includes psychological and physiological levels, will allow her to make recommendations, including psychological counseling for people with disorders and for healthy people. Strategies of emotional regulations are understood as an implementation or choice by the subjects of actions or ways of mediations that assist in emotional regulation. This is done with the use of an individual experience related to the optimizing of the emotional state. So, the author uses the modified Rosenzweig test and the assessment of aspiration in order to make a conclusion about the strategies of emotional regulation. The author uses the method of expert evaluation. 3 professional psychologists acted as experts. when studying patients with irreversible damage to the cardiovascular system, the author uses several physiological data, including blood pressure, catecholamine level, and different other indicators. And the author makes a conclusion that the value of increase in blood pressure proves that such patients have state anxiety, because these indicators did not show any trend towards the optimization, in contrast to similar indication in healthy people. So the author bases her assumptions on the cultural activity paradigm and on the methods of syndrome analysis. The author states that it is relevant to make use of the theoretical works by Franz Alexander. She says, suppression as a strategy of emotional regulation can be one of the factors that lead to the development of somatic symptoms and their chronification. The data that were obtained further during the tests confirm that there is a conflict between the motive to achieve and the motive to avoid failure. Summarizing the results, Elena Pervichko emphasizes that relying on the theoretical and methodological possibilities of the cultural activity paradigm and syndrome approach on the ideas of a system structure of emotional regulations and so on, she was able to identify the main aspects, including psychological and physiological levels. She was also able to identify the role of emotions and emotion regulations in patients with cardiovascular diseases. The conclusions summarize the main research findings. System of emotion regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases include psychological and physiological levels, and this system is different from that of healthy people due to the conflict between the motive to achieve and avoidance of failure. Besides, there are some distortions in symbolic mediation of emotions. Conclusion. I can say that Thesis by Elena Pervichko, Emotion Regulation in Patients with Cardiovascular Diseases, complies with the major requirements set forth by order as of the 1st of September 2016, 6821/1, and the candidate can be awarded the academic degree of the Doctor of Psychology. The specialization is 190044 Medical Psychology. Thank you. So, there were some comments in the report, and probably Elena Pervichko would like to answer. There were no specific questions, so we don't need any reply here. Now the floor is given to Professor Matanova. Dear Chairwoman, the research topic is very relevant. It is in the area of mental and somatic health. The thesis is relevant, and its relevance is beyond any doubt. According to the WHO, cardiovascular diseases rank first in terms of prevalence, the level of incapacitation and premature mortality. Recently, we have seen evidence about the important role of psychological factors in the cardiovascular diseases. As a result, recent years saw an increase in the number of psychosomatic studies where the role of emotions is emphasized. The theoretical relevance of the thesis is determined by the need for the development of an interpretation model and the need for the studies of symbolic mediation and personal reflection. This will allow us to understand the psychological content of emotion regulation. Emotions, as put by Vygotsky, are similar to other mental functions. According to the assumptions of the cultural activity paradigm, conscious regulation is predetermined by the conceptual structures of a personality, and it is combined with the cognitive elements of the personality. Recently, we have seen many research papers which are related to the research topic of the thesis. And this thesis is important for different scientists. However, psychosomatic medicine has not been studied thoroughly, because mostly we see phenomenological descriptions which do not allow us to understand how emotions are regulated and how emotion regulation is connected with symptom development. And experience of medically ill patients have not been studied thoroughly. Besides, we do not know how emotional regulation influences their rehabilitation. Therefore, the thesis fills in the gap in the previous research. Here, in the thesis, emotional regulation is regarded as a symptomic process. The model of emotional regulation has been developed, which allows us to see how emotional regulation is connected with the symptoms of cardiovascular diseases. The thesis deals with interdisciplinary research of emotional regulation in health and in disease, and she also identifies two types of emotional regulation strategies. The practical significance of the thesis is connected with the development of diagnostic programs and medical counseling to patients. The empirical evidence reveals that psychological counseling with such patients must have a motivational approach and lead to personal reflection. The thesis has a traditional structure. It is logical and reflects the research topic and the hypothesis. The thesis covers a wide range of issues, and we can say that the author set up multifaceted objectives and purposes, as well as analyzed the existing theoretical assumptions. The thesis allowed Elena Pervichko to identify two hypotheses. The first one is that emotional regulation has two levels, and the second hypothesis is that personal reflection and symbolic mediation of emotions serve as significant psychological mechanisms of emotion regulation. She identified three specific hypotheses about the presence of motivational conflict, the influence of emotion tension, of the efficiency of emotional regulation, and the stability of emotional tension. I can say that the objectives were formulated very accurately, and the relevance is not questioned here. One of the advantages of the thesis is the empirical research, which was done at a very professional level. So she was able to develop the model which allowed her to take into account different indicators. To make a judgment about the mental states, she used the method of expert evaluation. The author also used the modified Rosenzweig method and the method of content analysis. To identify conflict between motive to achieve and avoidance of failure, the author used a modified Heckenhaus test. And she also used a packet of statistical analysis program in order to analyze her data. She used both a clinical sample and a control sample of patients. The thesis is based on a wide range of theoretical works, and the reference list includes the works of Russian and foreign scholars. The reference list includes 859 items, both in English and in Russian languages. The theoretical and methodological foundation of the thesis is the cultural activity paradigm in studying emotions. The literary review includes controversial and debatable points, both in Russian and foreign works. Elena Pervichko was also able to lay down a solid basis for her empirical research. As a result, we can say that she came to the recent conclusion that emotion regulation in health and in disease is a system which includes physiological and psychological levels. At a psychological level, she identified motivational and conceptual and operational and technical levels. Meaningful psychological mechanisms of emotional regulation include personal reflection and symbolic mediation. The system of emotional regulation with cardiovascular diseases is different from the system in healthy people. Emotional tension is a background characteristic and has a negative impact on emotional regulation. Ineffective emotional regulation is a psychological reason for symptoms development in cases of mitral valve prolapse and hypertension. Elena Pervichko was able to extend and clarify the assumptions related to emotional regulations in disease and in health. The practical significance of the dissertation is beyond any doubt. The research findings can be used further, and the materials of the thesis can be used to develop courses at universities and to assess group risks. In general, Elena Pervichko was able to write a thesis which makes a contribution to the research topic. The main research findings are reflected in the academic papers. The candidate published 92 academic papers in high-ranking Russian and international journals with a high impact factor. 58 papers were published in peer-reviewed journals. She also made presentations at international conferences. So the thesis by Pervichko is relevant and it has a scientific novelty and scientific significance. It was done at a very high theoretical and empirical level. Elena Pervichko was able to come to reasoned conclusions. So I can say that the research topic, the familiarity with the prior research, the well-structured thesis and the empirical data, the ability to analyze the data allows me to give a positive assessment to the thesis. Therefore, thesis by Elena Pervichko complies with the major requirements set forth by order as of the 1st of September 2016, number 6821/1, and I can say that the candidate can be awarded the academic degree of the Doctor of Psychology. The specialization is 190044, Medical Psychology, Psychological Science. Thank you very much. You don't have to make any comments because there are no questions in the report. Now, dear colleagues, I think we should make a small 3-minute break.
Уважаемые коллеги, мы продолжаем заседание диссертационного совета по защите диссертации.
Dear colleagues, we are continuing the panel session. As I have already said, we have received a number of extra documents which we received. First of all, I would like to say a few words about these documents. As I have said, the Expert Center of the Academy of Science made a record of originality. We think that the text of the thesis is original and the originality is 95%. The 5% are related to different cliches, names of educational universities, and quotations. Therefore, according to our expert analysis, we can say that the text can be regarded as original, which means it has a high level of originality. The record of originality was signed by our colleagues, and I have told you their names already. This record also provides a statistical report concerning each quotation. Unfortunately, I cannot read it out, but the document is in the file. Besides, we have received 12 extra reports on the thesis. These reports are from the members of the academic community, and I must tell at least briefly. So, we have received reports from Professor Bondarenko from Kiev National University, from Gorokhovskaya, who is a professor, from Moscow University of Medicine and Dentistry, named after Yevdokimov, Professor Zalevsky, a member of the Russian Academy of Science and a professor of the University of Humanities, named after Kant, from Professor Krasnov, who is the director of the Research Institute of Psychiatry. And we have also received a report from Professor Martin Sone, the head of the Department of Psychology in the University of Riga. Report from Professor Rogacheva. She is the head of the Department of Rehabilitation Diagnostics and Monitoring in the Regional Rehabilitation Center in Sverdlovsk. Also, we have received a report from Safuanov, who is a professor in the center named after Serbsky, a report from Sokolov, Professor Sokolov, who is the head of the Department of Professional Diseases in the Moscow University of Medicine and Dentistry, from Professor Tvorogova, the head of the Department of Medical Psychology of the first Moscow Institute named after Sechenov, from Chernorizov, Doctor of Psychology, head of the Department of Psychophysiology in the Moscow State University, from Juana Mezic, Doctor of Medicine, Professor of Psychology, and the Professor at a medical school in New York, and also a report from Yultonsky, Doctor of Medical Science, Professor of the Department of Clinical Science of the Moscow University of Medicine and Dentistry. We also have 6 implementation records, and also we have a protocol of the endorsement of empirical data. I must say that the above-mentioned reports are positive. They highlight that the research topic is relevant and was done at a modern level of research. Besides, this research is in line with the current trends towards personalized medicine. The reports emphasize the significance and practical relevance of the research dealing with emotional regulations in health and in disease. The reports also say that the research is advanced and has a very important significance for the future research. So, and the reports mention that emotion regulation in patients with cardiovascular diseases complies with the major requirements set forth by Order 6821/1, and the candidate, Elena Pervichko, can be awarded the academic degree of the Doctor of Psychology. The specialization is 190004 Medical Psychology. However, some reports have comments and questions. I'm going to read out the questions and I will ask Elena Pervichko to answer these questions. So Professor Bondarenko says, I would like to ask, how does the author distinguish between emotional sufferings and emotional states? Because this is very important for the Russian tradition. However, the thesis sometimes uses these terms interchangeably. The chapters have different endings. Probably she should have done this differently in order to make the text more logical and reasoned. Professor Zalewski says, the author writes very thoroughly about emotional regulation. I think she should have paid more attention to emotional regulation in norm, not only in disease. Next question. How the specifics in emotion regulation are typical for patients with cardiovascular diseases. Number 3. I think that the empirical data allows us to make broader generalizations for the psychological science. From Professor Rogacheva, Doctor of Psychology. She says the following. I cannot agree with the fact that anger and fear can be regarded only as negative emotions. Number 2, the thesis does not say anything about practical recommendations for counseling, although the text mentions that it is possible to make such conclusions. From the next question from Fafosiyanov. It is very important to make further research into the psychosomatic medicine, and the work allows us to make theoretical interpretations in this area. And the author writes about the interdependence of the psychological and somatic factors. However, the author doesn't say anything about these issues in the final part of the thesis. However, this approach seems to be new and advanced. The data allows us to speak about the mediation of emotions, which is dependent on the cognitive and emotional activities of the individual. So, these aspects were not part of the research in the thesis, although there was enough theoretical evidence. From Professor Tvorogova. I think that the results are described in too much detail. Can we say that the specific features of emotional regulation are typical for patients with cardiovascular diseases? And the next question is it justified to have a multi-level approach and not a multi-component approach to emotional regulation? From Professor Martinsone, I think we should write a separate paragraph about practical recommendations. From Professor Yeltovsky, for research findings number 1, 3, 4, and 5 are very similar to the conclusions and vice versa. While conducting the analysis, the relevant paragraphs are given. The author was able to compare the results with the results that were received previously. However, this is not done to a sufficient level. Out of the numerous publications, 4 papers were in Russian. Number 7, 8, 9, 14 do not reflect, as I think, the results of the research, and I don't think the author should have included these papers in the list of publications. So, the next comment. Emotion regulation was regarded through emotion regulation and personal reflection with the help of the Rosenzweig methods and with the help of expert evaluation methods. The author also described emotion regulation and used different questionnaires. However, these methods are doubtful. The strategy of nomination as a stable strategy can be identified when we speak about numerous statements and not on the basis of singular statements made by patients. The identification of strategies using emotion regulation using the method of Rosenzweig should have been done with the use of different other methods and questionnaires. For example, the questionnaire developed by Grosso. Number 5. The text does not have any criteria on including or excluding the patients with cardiovascular diseases. Therefore, we cannot say anything about the relevant symptoms in these patients or understand why these patients were included in the clinical sample. We don't know whether these patients have any relevant symptoms or serious symptoms or a combination of symptoms. At pages 68, 69, the author writes about emotion regulation. What does she think about emotion regulation and emotion and the strategy of emotion protection? Now you have 15 minutes to answer these questions. You have no more than 15 minutes. Please, if the comments are the same, answer just once and provide one reply.
Mrs. Chairwoman, colleagues who have submitted the additional reports, I'm really thankful for the evaluation of my study, for your opinions and remarks. I'll follow the order. As regards a remark made by Professor Bondarenko about what we call emotional phenomenon, please do not repeat the comments. People can find them online. Please answer the questions. I'll try to keep within the agenda. we define emotions according to the basic statements of cultural activity paradigm as the reflection of some event in life as regards their relation, the quality of the equality to the subject's inner world. This term is defined by Leontiev. It was made in 1971. This is Leontiev's publication of this year, page 35. According to cultural activity paradigms, emotions are really complex from the psychological viewpoint class of psychic phenomena, from the point of higher mental functions. And I'm thankful to those present here who have made their contribution into development of this topic. They have several characteristics. They are formed during the lifetime. They are voluntary in regulation. In our thesis, we consider sufferings from the point of view given by Vygotsky. He regards sufferings as the dynamic unit of consciousness. He says that suffering represents affectionate and intellectual processes, and this gives a very important methodological foundation to our work. We have a well provided for possibility to regard the ways we give emotions according with the qualities they have. Let me note that on the one hand, I agree with the questions given by Professor Bondarenko. However, the definition of suffering by Vygotsky is very close to what Leontiev writes about emotions. Talking about psychological conditions, we stick to the tradition popular in modern psychological discourse when people speak about emotional reactions, conditions and properties. This traditional holds true for the Russian research works by Kulikov, Ganzenov, and works by Charles Izard. We use Charles Izard's methodology to evaluate anxiety. Therefore, we make use of his terminology. Talking about the endings to the chapters, I'd like to say that in a number of doctoral theses I have studied, empirical chapters would be often summarized by conclusions. I also followed this tradition. As regards remarks given by Zalewski, I accept that there is an impression that normative description is given to a lesser degree than the descriptions about emotion regulation. But my specialization is medical psychology, so that's the way it is. We didn't aim to answer this question in our study. This might make a very promising research line in my future works. And I'm sure we will find similar emotional relation in other patients as well. The comment about more substantial interpretation and discussion, I agree that I could have made the discussion of the results I have obtained more diverse and substantial, but there is not always enough opportunity to do that. Coming to comments by Professor Rogachova, I accept her two comments. The anger, the emotion of anger, we regard it as a negative one, though it's a controversial point, of course. In our psychosemantic research, we see that healthy people never say they feel anger. There is always a component of joy or surprise in their descriptions. So this is to a great extent typical for diseased people. As for the remarks by Professor Safwanov, I accept them, and I'm really thankful for the high opinion of my work. I can regard that as an impetus for my future research work. It has already become the topic of my current research. Now let me answer to the remarks by Professor Tvergova. I have already answered question 1. As for question 2, the answer is partly provided in the Thesis. Let me quote. That's a quotation from the works by Kornilova and Smirnov. A multi-level approach is a unifying factor for the works of Vygotsky and Leontiev. The levels of classification are widespread in psychology. As regards the foundations of cultural activity paradigm by Vygotsky and Leontiev, there we have a multi-level classification. Now remarks by Yeltonsky. He talks about conclusions. In my opinion, conclusions have to reflect something provided in the research findings. I don't see that anything copies the other thing. They always work as logical continuation. I have focused on clinical psychological works in the parts of my thesis where I speak about results. I don't think that's a good idea to introduce these aspects into the general psychological context. As for the publications in the research topic, which do not reflect the results of my research, I can only say that I tried to provide a wide range of the results of both empirical and theoretical research. And this partly answers the question by Professor Tkostov. My publication list was signed by the academic secretary and deputy dean of Moscow State University. The the next question is complicated both from the theoretical and the logical viewpoint. In my thesis, I focus a lot on that. Some might regard that as insufficient, as we see that questions arise. Though we see repetitive answers within a single question. So if we see a repetitive idea within one question, then in this type of answers, it's difficult to distinguish between the two concepts. Maybe we should have given a different term to that. So we use these traditional terms. As for the questionnaire, I answered that question when answering the questions on the reports on the thesis. I think it will become the focus of our future research works. As for the patients with mitral valve prolapse, having their treatment in hospitals, we only had outpatients. As for the strategy of emotion regulation and coping strategies, I gave a definition of what we refer to as emotion regulation. We used the classical definition of coping strategies. The difference of the strategies lies in the difference that we have in this terminology about emotion regulation and coping strategies. Let us move on. We continue with the overview of other documents submitted by the Dissertation Board. So, as I said earlier, a letter of appeal from Professor Tkosov was submitted. The complete text of the appeal is posted on the official website of St. Petersburg State University. It states that the dissertation was twice discussed at the department and was given negative reviews. Professor Khostov doubts that there has been any research about nonverbal aspects. As regards the letter of appeal, there was a panel session of the Dissertation Board, and there we applied to Elena Pervichko to provide materials and video recordings of the experiment. And also, we asked the academic secretary of SPBU to postpone the panel session of the Dissertation Board because that required the creation of the minutes of the meeting, which you can find on the official website. We have, as for the minutes of the Dissertation Board number 2, we have listened to the presentation of Elena Pervichko. They actually copied the ideas provided by the candidate in the letter submitted by Elena Pervichko. You can find them on the official university's website as well. The Dissertation Board has stated that the answers that Elena Pervichko has provided as regards the results of the dissertation and the experiments are disputable in their character, which is typical for any branch of science. And her results have received favorable review by the academic community, which we can see in her publications by in top-rated peer-reviewed journals. The discussion can continue today. As Professor Hostov remained doubtful about the research in non-verbal parameters in emotion regulation, the members of the dissertation board have studied the video recordings submitted by Elena Pervichko, listened to the comments she has provided, and have come up with their conclusion on the issue. Elena Pervichko has submitted 5 video cassettes and 5 video files in the digital as digital copies. These materials show the experiment of healthy people and patients with cardiovascular diseases. The experiments were conducted early in the 2000s. The research subjects were given a number of tasks to analyze their levels of aspiration. We could see the posture, the mimics, and other the changes in the tone of voice of the examinees. So, though the quality of the material is not very high, still it was enough to evaluate the non-verbal parameters of emotion regulation, which makes the subject of Pervichko's research. She has also submitted the recordings and comments of the experiments of all the 5 groups of patients. I'm not going to list the 5 groups of patients. She has also provided materials on the control group, people of mature age and young age. So the video recordings she has provided do not correspond to the number of the total people that took part in the research, which was 485. Nonetheless, these video recordings provide enough data on the nonverbal behavior of examinees. So we can state that the video recording of experiments in nonverbal parameters of motion regulation took place based upon the materials submitted by Pervichko. Though it does not cover all the examinees, the dissertation board has made the conclusion that the study of non-verbal parameters of emotion regulation based upon the expert evaluation of the reactions of examinees took place. So the dissertation board addressed the academic secretary of St. Petersburg State University to set up the new date of the defense. I focused on that at length because on the 15th of September we had another letter of appeal by Professor Hostov. Professor Hostov there provides his doubts that the dissertation board was able to make conclusions about the quality of the conducted research because that only took 5 hours. Besides, Professor Hostov touches upon the issue he raised in the first letter of appeal about the ethical aspects of the textual material that he printed in one of his prior works with Elena Pervichko as his co-author. Professor Hostov regards this issue as an ethical aspect, though we are conducting a scientific scholarly discussion. I would like Pervichko to give her opinion about this issue. Please provide your comments later. This letter gives other critical remarks of ethical character. For example, that statements by Elena Pervichko undermine Professor Hostov's business reputation. I think this is not the right context to discuss this question. Could you please comment on the issue with the textual material, please?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairwoman. Dear colleagues, dear attendees, this research paper was published not long ago. Professor Hostov provided this text so that it could be used in the overall paper. We used part of this text because he was my co-author, and the text dates back to 2013 or 2014. This text is posted on the website. It is included in the scientific report of Moscow State University. As for the extent of work done by the two co-authors, I think that both from the ethical and from the contentful point of view, I am not entitled to check for plagiarism. Therefore, I received the record of originality from Professor Zhdanova, who is the academic secretary of the Faculty of Psychology. Have I answered the question? Thank you. Now, that's all for the review of the extra documents. Now we are proceeding to the general discussion. Probably the board members would like to give their opinion, and all the other attendees can also give their opinion about the thesis. Dear colleagues, I understand that we can make abstractions from the details, otherwise we would not be able to conduct any research, would not take into account the characteristics which are not relevant. But we should not alienate ourselves from a social part of emotional regulation. So we should not ignore the social aspect of emotional regulation, because physiological and psychological level is not enough, and I still insist on my comment. Does anybody else want to give their opinion? Now, who wants to give their opinion? The floor is given to Professor Hostov. First, I would like to give some explanation, so I have 5 minutes. So I would like to give some brief account of my opinion. Here we have seen the distortion of my words. I have never said that you can't use my text for the academic paper. I said that the text referring to cancer patients cannot be used in relation to this topic. Professor Yoltonsky voiced a similar opinion. there are 5 papers where I am one of the authors, and I assure you that none of these academic papers are referred to the research topic. The fact that it was confirmed by somebody is not relevant. So, the confirmation means that Elena Pervichko is one of the authors, but it does not mean that the academic papers refer to the research topic. I think this is important. So, I think that the provision says if there are works which are not relevant to the research topics, then this fact leads to some implications. I'm not sure about the nature of these implications. Now, I would like to stress once more that the thesis was discussed twice at our university, and I read this thesis very attentively and expressed my opinion about it. So they were not taken into account, and I would like to stress my opinion again. So, research finding number 1. I think it's very mundane because it does not contain any scientific novelty. We have known for 100 years that emotions have both physiological and psychological aspects. Scholars in cognitive and other aspects of science stressed this idea. I have said already that research finding number 3 is impossible. Maybe I'm not acquainted with all the methods in science, but for me this research finding looks like nonsense. And research finding I'm going to talk about now is this one. About the fact that these patients need psychological counseling is obvious. We can come to this conclusion without reading this thesis. I'll come back to what gives most doubts. The modified Rosenzweig test is not relevant because this test includes 24 pictures. This test is not accurate. For some reason, these pictures were changed into percentage ratio. And here maybe we see any significant differences, but they cannot be interpreted from a psychological point of view, because the difference here is very minor. It includes 1 or 2 differences in answers. So this is just an imagination. Now, speaking about the fact that she used anxiety. She used a very small test before the research and after the research. So if the person does not have any memory problems, then he will not show any changes, although the methods show us that we must use split samples and different other methods. Here we do not see the use of these methods. Therefore, I believe that this thesis is unconvincing. The review of the prior works does not cast any doubts, and this is the only part of the work which does not arise any concerns and doubts. Because the new things and the novelty is not proven. How can you take a questionnaire and identify different scales and use it for further research. For example, how can humor be related to the research topic? I worked with cancer patients a lot, and I can say that the only research finding which is relevant to this work is that in patients with research cancer, most things are irrelevant because they're physically ill and so on. And we cannot say that this abstract story can say something in the attitude of the patients. My experience proves otherwise. I think it's impossible. I'd like to say once again, the research of emotional regulation should have employed the model which shows the main disorder, for example, obsession and something like that. Here, the author took some different aspects. We have a functional disorder of hypertension, and the prolapse, the mitral valve prolapse, turn out to be very similar in the thesis, although these are quite different disorders. Thank you very much, Professor Tkostov.
Professor Tkostov, thank you for the interest you have showed to my work and for the discussion. I'm not really ready to accept your viewpoints as regards the modification of projective methods. In the Russian clinical and psychological tradition, this is something that is a work in practice. My thesis has been discussed twice at the department. Professor Sokolov and Professor Nikolaev were the experts, and they saw this Rosenzweig test modification as an advantage of my research work, because it is in line with the traditional methods that we use in Russian science. One of the experts used the same approach, and she regarded mine as a very effective one as well. I'm not the first one who has implemented these modified methods of Rosenzweig. There are other Russian scholars who have used the same method. The Department of Personal Psychology uses that a lot. Let's take works by Shlagina, for example. Many members of our academic community say that Rosenzweig is really a nice finding, because projective methods open up more opportunity for diagnostics these days. We have access to the internet, and our examinees, both healthy and diseased, know which materials are used, and they know about the methods and even how to analyze the data. I think the method was relevant to the objectives of my study. As for the Spurberg's questionnaire, in Russian and foreign reference literature, it is stated that this questionnaire is a first-rank method to evaluate the level of anxiety. This works highlight that to overcome the methodological difficulties specified by Professor Khostov, this questionnaire, which analyzes anxiety levels, it is advisable and it is possible to use that twice. For example, if we take school children, we can use that before or after the class, or before and then after some examination. Does it answer all your questions, Professor Khostov? We are now at the point of discussion. These are not actually questions. As regards the evaluation of the quality of psychological conditions, it is also a tradition to evaluate biochemical parameters. As for the evaluation of arterial blood pressure, this is also an important parameter, and many reference literature, many reference works advise to use that as well in similar research works. Professor Khostov, I really respect you as a scientist and the personality. You're the head of the department I work for, but I can't accept that conclusion 11 is mundane. I can't but include it onto the list of conclusions. I have already specified that in the letters I submitted to St. Petersburg State University as an answer to your letter of appeal, Professor Khostov. So I specified that with other patients, no work has ever stated that they need any kind of psychological support or counseling. As doctors, we meet not only healthy people, but also patients, and these patients need treatment. As regards your comment about the first conclusion, here I cannot agree with you either. On the one hand, that's a very typical statement. We can find it in many founding works in this methodological approaches. We can find them in Leontiev's works, Smirnov's works, but none of them has ever applied this construct as regards emotion regulation. So you are now repeating what's given on the letters posted on the website. So the interested parties can find this information there. I would like you to answer just one particular question. Which design did you use to make conclusions if you had only one group? It's no doubt that biochemical parameters are necessary. Which design did you use? Maybe I just don't know it. I think there is some misunderstanding that arose this question. Unfortunately, I don't have the text of my dissertation with me. I can show you one table. It is on the slide here. So have a look at this table. It focuses on the data with people who have hypertension and work. This is a very expensive research to make. Not only me, but also my colleagues would be happy to conduct this experiment on a wider group of patients. I have this table in the Thesis as well. I will show it later. This is also reflected in one of my papers It is published in English in the journal Psychology in Russia. That was issued in 2013. So I don't see that we have anyone else who would like to take the floor. So now let's proceed with our agenda. And this is a 5-minute break. I would like everyone to leave the room and to give the dissertation board a chance to discuss the results of the panel session.
Dear colleagues, now we are proceeding with the open vote on the issue on conferring the academic degree. So I put to vote this issue. I would like to say that the decision of the dissertation board is positive, provided more than 50% of the dissertation board voted for. However, the number of board members must be at least 3. This is according to the appropriate order issued at St. Petersburg State University. So I put to the vote the issue of conferring the academic degree. Please answer my question about the possibility to confer the academic degree of the Doctor of Psychology to Elena Pervichko. Those who are for, please raise your hands. Those who are against, please raise your hands. Everybody is for. Who does not vote? One colleague. So you have seen the results of the vote. I must say that the results of the vote reflect our discussion. The discussion was quite difficult. The thesis has some disadvantages, as any research work. The authors of the report spoke about these disadvantages. However, the volume of the thesis and the material of the thesis, the theoretical and methodological foundations of the research show that this thesis is credible and the author can be awarded the degree of the Doctor of Science. You have seen that there were some relevant comments, for example, the fact that the author ignored the social factor. However, we come to the conclusion and we have made a decision that we can grant the academic degree of the Doctor of Science. At least 4 board members voted for this decision. Thank you. The dissertation panel is over. Now I would like to give the floor to the candidate. Dear Chairwoman, dear colleagues, and dear attendees of the dissertation panel, thank you for the discussion and thank you for everything. I would like to voice my great appreciation of St. Petersburg State University and its rector, Professor Nikolai Kropachev, for the honor given to me. Thank you for the opportunity to defend my thesis in St. Petersburg State University. I would like to express my appreciation to the dissertation board, which organized several discussion panels. I would like to thank personally Professor Sholkova. I would like to thank you for the discussion that took place today. I would like to thank the academic secretary, Professor Gnotov, and the staff of the Center for Expert Advice. Thank you for taking into account different aspects and for the psychological aspect as well. I would like to thank the doctors, my colleagues from 2 medical departments of Moscow University of Medicine and Dentistry. I would like to thank the Faculty of Psychology of St. Petersburg State University. and I have the honor to work there, and I would like to thank Professor Tkostov, the head of this department where I work, for his support and for his discussion. I think that my thesis was completed due to the cooperation of different colleagues, and thank you to all the research subjects who took place in my experiment. So I'm very glad to be here right now. I'm very honored. Thank you. Now the panel session is over.